All right, our last panel, political accountability and the administrative state. It was said earlier, this is the Center for the Study of Administrative State, not the study of administrative law. But there is a famous line in one of the famous cases, in Myers versus United States, one of the cases about independent agencies. Chief Justice Taft reminds the court's readers that the president is tasked by the Constitution to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And of course, that's one thing the president can't do single-handedly. It requires the entire administration. Of course, Chief Justice Taft knew that better than anybody, given his previous job as President Taft. And so an issue we've returned to over and over again in the course of discussions today is, what is the relationship between the presidency and the civil service? Right? We can go back to Justice Elena Kagan's famous writings on presidential administration and many others who have talked about the relationship between presidential power and public administration. And so we're very grateful for our three speakers today to join us for this last discussion, taking some of the themes that have been discussed already today and returning to a lot of those themes, surely, through the lens of the relationship between the politically accountable leadership of agencies, the president and his appointees, and the civil service, the career civil service that Congress has insulated to some extent from partisanship for the sake of good government and technocratic expertise. And so rather than introduce all three of the speakers at once, let me just introduce them one at a time as it's their turn to speak. And we'll hear first from Katie Bailey. She is Legislative Director for Senator Mike Braun. She previously served in numerous capacities in Congress, most recently as Director of Governmental Affairs for the Senate's Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee under both Senator Coburn and Senator Johnson. Her full biography is laid out, well, not your full biography, but your professional biography is laid out here in the brochure, so I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Katie.
Thank you very much, Professor White. And I have to say, first, thank you for having me here. It's a fascinating discussion and one that we don't always get to hear when we're churning on the treadmill up on Capitol Hill. But I have to say, in the office of Senator Mike Braun, where I'm currently stationed, we have one of Scalia Law's graduates, and his favorite professor is Professor White. It's a man by the name of Riley Inman, and he sends his greetings to you, and we are sure lucky to have a Scalia graduate amongst our ranks because he is fantastic.
I'll be sending the honorarium.
Yeah, okay. So the title really made me pause and think, and I am not a lawyer, so I'm humbled to be in this room with the minds that are in this room, but to take from another field of homiletics, which is the field my father has made his craft. The title sent me down a course of what I would call expository preaching. I mean, what is political accountability? And the term bureaucracy can mean an awful lot of things, and I would also say that the connotation with bureaucracy over my time on Capitol Hill has sure changed and how people use it and view it. So I wanted to maybe use my few minutes in having this conversation to dissect that a little bit and to share a few thoughts of where I sit on Capitol Hill, what my view on political accountability of the bureaucracy is. We all know that in a democracy, political accountability is of chief importance. This is most immediately known to us through our elections. We have the chance to kick out the people that we don't want representing us anymore. But what happens after the elections? What does political accountability really look like? From where I'm sitting, there's a couple different routes that we take when we're talking about political accountability as someone on the Hill looking at the government before us. One is the obvious legislative. We have a policy responsibility to enact our laws and to keep watch over them. The other side of it, though, is the oversight, and that's really where I've spent a lot of my years on Capitol Hill. Spending my time is in Congressional Oversight and Investigations. And, you know, I love one of the quotes that George Mason has about the role for us to carry out our legislative responsibilities through oversight, because I think it's one that many of us hold dear, and it's that on the Hill, we're not only legislators, but we have inquisitorial powers, and we just don't have to use them occasionally. We must be using them frequently to be a check on the administrative state. That's a quote some of us have said over the years that we should have on the walls of our committee hearing rooms to remind us of this power that we have to not just write the laws and amend the laws, but to have the oversight capacity fulfilled as well. So that's generally how I view political accountability from where I'm sitting. Obviously, we have separate branches, and we have what the administration can do through its own role as CEOs of our agencies and the executive orders that James just did such a lovely job telling us about. But on the Hill, I look at this through the lens of the legislative and the oversight. And when we're talking about the bureaucracy, I mean, this is really 2 million non-postal, of course, employees that we're talking about relative to an American population of over 300 million. So what does our political accountability look like for the federal bureaucracy? This is where I had to pause and think, good gravy, well, what is the lens that we look at political accountability through? And I think that's, for me, a thought-provoking thing, because if you get the lens wrong, the residual dominoes that fall have some pretty severe implications, either for the bureaucracy itself or for the American people. James didn't do the full quote, but I'll give him a little bit of slack. In the executive order, the lens that I believe that they're looking at their work through, to quote them directly, is to empower our civil servants to best help others. The government must always operate more efficiently and more securely. And I thought, that's the lens, right? The civil service truly exists to serve the American people. The civil service exists to help serve others. And so when I'm thinking personally about political accountability, the lens is the civil service fulfilling that goal? And I think that is also the lens through which the executive orders attempted to apply their work, and that's why it's the first thing you'll see when you pull them up. But I do think on the flip side, accountability it can't be arbitrary when it comes to the civil service. It has to be fair, it has to be equitable, and it has to be bound by our Constitution and our laws. And we have wonderful people working in the civil service. If you've ever had the opportunity to attend, for example, the Partnership for Public Services annual awards dinner, you'll hear about stories of people in the civil service that are literally changing lives. And it is a humbling and amazing thing to see the people we have in the civil service. So there's a balance here of getting it right, making sure that accountability isn't a hack, isn't unfair, and that it's bound by the laws that bind us. So where exactly are we right now? If that's political accountability, and that may be the lens that we're looking through political accountability, my personal thought is that we've had some failures on the Hill, and some of those are attributable to special interests, some of those are attributable to the weak backbone that we have. But I think one thing President Trump has very keenly discerned is that there are aspects of the civil service that are off kilter. James talked about some of those eloquently. We know that the federal civil service, on average, has pay and benefits that are 17% higher than those in the private sector. And there are all the caveats to go along with that. James did a good job sharing some of those. But that is something that is known and felt by people, that there is an unfairness or an unbalance here. I was just talking to one of our previous presenters, the Department of Ed, and through some of the oversight we used to do on the Hill, I was always amazed that we have this merit system that we've created in the 70s in our government, but what I see when I look at the data is a government that rewards tenure over merit. And in his agency, for example, it's not just that, like other agencies, pay and benefits are more generous on average for federal employees than it is in the private sector, but you have, for example, 2.4% of ed employees in 2008 that were making over $150,000. And by 2015, that went up to over 11%. I mean, this is more than just merit. This is a heavily tenure-based system that we have in place. And I think when the American people or other federal employees, in responding to the FEVS data each year, Fed survey each year, they kind of wonder, what exactly are we getting, and is it in the right lens of helping people as the ends? We know that federal employees overwhelmingly get exceptional ratings. 99% of federal employees, permanent non-SES employees, receive a rating of fully successful. 61% were rated as outstanding. Only 0.1% unacceptable. 0.1. In no realm of my life ever, including my own household, we had a 1.1% unacceptable mark. And I think people understand that, and that's why we have federal employees themselves saying, 23% agreeing with the statement that pay raises are not given out based on merit, the merit of which people are performing their jobs. So I do think that President Trump has discerned that something is off kilter. What I also think is that he has done a good job discerning that Congress has not done its job. Okay, so I'm going to point the barrel back at me, and I will speed up so that Tammy can also get her time. If we created our civil service laws in the 70s, maybe the year I was born, I'm just saying, we've neglected it. We're not passing laws. I've been up there working on Title V issues, not my whole life, but almost a good part of the last 20 years, we have been doing nothing. And I thought for sure, last year, the 40th anniversary, we're going to pass something. It's the 40th anniversary. How can we not pass a single reform? Congress knows that things are broken. We know that the thing has not been updated. We know that the occupational series has not been updated since the 40s. We know that it takes 6 months to a year to get rid of poor performing employees. We know that tenured federal employees are 44 times less likely to get laid off than their private sector peers. I mean, something's off kilter here, right? Congress is doing nothing. We know the problems with union official time. I could go on and on about the list of things that we're keenly aware of on the legislative side. So, right, the political accountability. We have a couple tools on the Hill. We have legislative and we have oversight. And on the legislative side, nothing is happening. Nothing is happening. To give you one example of that, and then I'll start to wrap up, James spoke about union official time. There is a very simple bill that has been moving through Congress for years and years and years that says, please just give us data on official time usage. How much? The cost? What is it being used for? Every Congress, it goes nowhere. And last Congress, I think, we're going to get this done. We have both chambers that should agree with this bill in power. We have the Trump administration. And I'm telling you, on the House side, it went through markup. This is just transparency. It's not touching official time, just transparency. It got through the House Oversight Committee and Government Reform on markup with an amendment from Ranking Member Cummings to add more disclosure about data points that would be favorable to the union's perspective on official time, accepted by voice vote. The bill passed by voice vote. The entire markup took a matter of minutes. Went through the House on suspension, which means no recorded votes. Flew over to the House, flew through the Senate Committee on Homeland Security, cleared the Republican hotline. Hotline is the behind the veil process we have in the Senate for passing bills. No holds on the Republican side, and that was fall of 17. From that point forward, secret holds on the Democratic hotline, and that thing went nowhere. So if we can't even get a simple transparency bill done, how in the world on the Hill are we going to do legislative accountability for our administrative state? It's not happening. On the oversight side, I will say that I think we do a better job, but we're a small group of merry misfits that do congressional oversight, and we can only do so much when you look at the numbers and the expanse before us. But I mean, it's the same thing on the oversight side. We know about the people who are watching porn at NSF. We know about the people at the Forest Service who are raping their own. We know about the DEA agents who are in Colombia having parties with prostitutes that were paid for by drug cartels and never were fired and only given minor infractions. this stuff is known, and if it's not known, it won't take long for somebody to write a whistleblower hotline in the Hill for it to start to be known. But it is an uphill climb to do the oversight, and even when we do the oversight, we can't always get the legislative reforms in place. So on a union official time, for example, we got all of the data on who the employees are at each agency, how much they make, what their job's supposed to be, and how much official time they're supposed to be carrying out. We could see which people were 100%, for example, in a certain part of the country where they were supposed to be psychologists at VA facilities, and then you'd have veterans coming back for help who would end up committing suicide on property because they couldn't get the help they need. And here you are, you're thinking you had a 100% official time employee supposed to be doing nothing but psychology, never there helping that individual. We can see that perhaps it is not reasonable to have 60 to 70, 100% official time people at the IRS who are supposed to be answering call center calls, even in the height of tax season, who are 100% union official time and never go to work. But oversight is great for perhaps flushing out bad apples who would rather quit than testify before Congress, who perhaps get so uncomfortable that their agencies help push them out a little bit faster. It's not always enough for us to get the legislative reforms done. So I guess I would wrap up by saying I think political accountability from the perspective of the Hill is extremely important. I think that's why people like me exist, is to try to reform things that we see that are broken in our laws and to have the oversight necessary to justify the policy changes. We don't always do a good job, and sometimes we try and we still can't get things to go anywhere. But I have watched with fascination these executive orders and the different things that the Trump administration is trying to push through. And I never thought I'd see it happen. I think it takes guts, and I think the courts will address anything that is or isn't an overstep. But I think that this is the first time in a long time we've seen stuff happening. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it to Tammy.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce Tammy. Tammy Mccutchen is a principal at Littler Mendelsohn. She practices, she's a principal in the DC office. She's also vice president of strategy for Compliance HR, a company that develops applications using artificial intelligence to help companies make significant employment decisions. She is a leading expert on wage and hour issues, which is fitting, I suppose, given her service at the Labor Department, where she led the wage and hour division. Among other things, she's a chair. She chairs the Federal Society's practice group on labor and employment. Tammy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Although I am just a lawyer, I have had an unusual career path that has allowed me to not only manage, discipline, and terminate employees, but also to advise many private sector clients on doing that. And both in the private sector and the public sector. So my comments today, which by the way are just my opinions and not opinions of Littler or anybody else, got to say that, you know. They come from the perspective of a Senate-confirmed appointee managing a large career staff. At the Wage and Hour Division at DOL, my agency, I had an annual budget of $160 million at the time. It's much higher now, of course. I'm not, don't calculate how many years ago this was, please. But I had 1,400 career employees who were represented by 2 unions in 250 offices all over the country. And I want to focus today on the ability of federal managers, not just politicals like me, but career senior executive service federal managers, to discipline and terminate federal employees. Because you know what? Unless you have the power and the authority to give bad performance reviews, to discipline, and to terminate, we will never have political or any other accountability in our federal service. So at the outset, let me say that the vast majority of the career employees that I served with in the Wage and Hour Division, dedicated professionals executing their duties to enforce major employment laws like the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Family Medical Leave Act, Davis-Bacon, although I'm sure many of you don't like Davis-Bacon very much. But my deep state problems were far and a few between. I do hear from my friends serving in the Trump administration that this has changed. And that really makes our topic here more important than ever. Because let me tell you, based on my own experience, it is very difficult, and read that, much, much, much more difficult to discipline and terminate federal government employees than it is in the private sector. And you've heard some examples today of that, and I want to start out here giving three of my own examples based on actual incidents that I was involved with at the Wage and Hour Division. First, my badge flasher. A wage and hour investigator and managers, they carry a badge, right? Like it looks like a police badge. Why they need that, I'm not sure, but I have my own. It's on the wall. You can actually use it to get through TSA quickly. I was once asked by a TSA agent, "Are you carrying a gun?" And I said, "Not today." Luckily, wage and hour investigators have not yet been given guns. But here's what happened. I had a district manager, right? This is, there's me, there's the regional administrators, and then there's the district manager. So this is just like two away from me, GS15, sorry. And I got a call one day because this manager had showed up at a manufacturing plant in Mexico and flashed his badge to get into that plant to do an audit. Of course, you should not be using your federal credentials in another country, and in fact, this is a federal crime. I was told I couldn't fire him. Why? Because he had not been convicted yet, although he didn't deny that he was down there. Oh, and by the way, the whole trip was paid for by an outside monitoring company, right? A third-party outside company that hounds employers for labor law violations. Now so I was told can't fire him. I didn't listen to that advice. I did it anyway. And it was okay with them because 2 weeks later he was employed by the monitoring company that paid for his trip, so no harm for him. My second is my bank robber. An investigator called in sick one day, was on paid sick leave, but was then arrested driving the getaway car in a bank robbery. Again, I was advised I couldn't fire her because she hasn't been convicted yet. And there's no question she was in the car and driving away with the bank robbers. I actually fired her, not because of the bank robbery though, but because, and if those of you in the employment space might find this funny, I fired her for wage theft because she called in sick and was getting sick pay, right? So she was stealing money from my agency. My third is more, and those two are misconduct, and I want to talk about that. To me, the difference between misconduct and poor performance. And I sort of wish under the executive orders that they'd split those things, because I think it's much easier in terms of a cell, in terms of defending a lawsuit, to talk first about firing people who are doing this type of misconduct like we've heard, like actually violating the law. I think poor performance is much more difficult because that's much more subjective and frankly can change from supervisor to supervisor. But anyway, I did have a deep state attorney way back before that term was actually invented. As administrator of the Wage and Hour Division, I have authority to write opinion letters, which if employers rely on the opinion letters, that gives a complete affirmative defense from FLSA claims. And I wrote a letter regarding a particular exemption, and a DOL attorney would not approve my letter. A career DOL attorney would not approve my letter, stating that it was not legally supported, that I didn't have any legal support, and that's what the solicitor's office at DOL is supposed to do, is tell us when we have legal support for what we want to do. But you see, at the time, I had a very talented deputy who's gone on to much bigger and better things. His name's Eric Dryband. You may know him now. He is Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the DOJ. Anyway, he did some of his own research in support of the opinion letter I wanted to do, and he found a federal appellate case that said exactly what I wanted to say in my opinion letter. So we gave this attorney multiple occasions to reveal this case to us, and he didn't do it. So in the end, I could only reach one of two conclusions, right? Either he didn't find a major case, and attorneys in the room knows that that's probably unlikely not to find a federal appellate court case, or two, he was withholding information from me. And I think that's really a lot of the poor performance stuff that I'm hearing about today is withholding of information to political leadership. Now, I will tell you, of course, I told the Solicitor of Labor at the time about this, not one single thing was done. This attorney served many, many years before he retired normally, but I, of course, had lost all trust in my major attorney, the top attorney at the DOL on the Fair Labor Standards Act. But luckily, I had lots of attorneys on my staff, so we just started doing our own work rather than relying on the solicitor's office. So I will tell you, in the private sector, all three of these people would have been not only disciplined, but probably terminated. They'd lost bonuses. Something would have happened to them. Not only the misconduct cases, but somebody, an associate who misses a major case doesn't last long in a law firm. Don't get me started on the poor performers. The guy, for example, who did nothing but sleep all day, he was part of what DOL calls the RIP club. Have you ever heard of an RIP club? Retirement in place. Oh. Federal employees that are fully vested in their pensions, and they say, go ahead, fire me, I got my full pension. And there's an official, this is like a semi-official thing, right? Everybody knows about it, RIP club, retirement in place. So I know these seem like extreme cases, and they certainly do not happen every day, but there are many documented instances, as you heard from the other speakers today, using drugs. The sex talk line at EPA, did we mention that one? And we've heard about the statistics. Katie mentioned the 44 times less likely to get fired or laid off. There's also, a couple years ago, there was an article that said that federal employees are more likely to die of natural causes than they are to get fired. The problem is, of course, the difficulty, right? Which these executive orders are trying to get at. And the backgrounder in your materials that were passed out talked about the 4 different ways for employees, federal employees, to appeal. That is the Merit Service Protection Board, the whistleblower, the EEO, the Federal Labor Standards Act. But I want to show you a picture. This is from the fiscal year 2019 budget documents, because the backgrounder missed a couple things. He was just talking about the statutory means. And we got the grievance procedure here, and then most agencies have an internal equal employment opportunity office that employees can go through before they get to the EEOC. So this is what it takes. And then, of course, after all that's done, they can appeal to the federal courts. So we're talking two mechanisms internally, grievance and EEO to each agency, then the 4 external agencies like the Merit Service Protection Board, and then appeal to the federal circuit courts. And I'm surprised it's only 6 months to a year to go through this. It can be a lot longer, and this is crazy. And I don't think we're going to get accountability to either political or career senior executive service unless we severely cut this chart down to only 1, and this is what the backgrounder said, 1 means. Why do you need 4 bites at the apple, or 5, or 6? Let's get this down to 1. It's one of the things I don't really think the executive orders could, because this is all statutory, but this is where Congress has to come in. You gotta fix this, Katie. You gotta fix this. It's impossible.
It's not good for the people.
It is not. And I had in my notes too about the performance ratings, right? Bad in the private sector, when you want to terminate an employee in this age of challenges to terminations that are also significant, you have to have bad performance reviews before you can go ahead and terminate somebody without litigation risks. But if 99% of federal employees are getting exceeds or outstanding, you cannot build the case. Now, why do all of those federal employees get such high ratings? Well, because if you give a low rating, it's going to be grieved. That's right. It's going to get grieved. And that's, it's so much time, right? When you're a political appointee, you count on 4 years, and you don't want to spend half of your 4 years in grievance. And so that's why I think that part of the executive orders are so important, to get the terminations and the discipline out of the grievance process. After all, they have 4 other mechanisms to appeal. Is grievance needed first when there's like 4 other bites of the apple? Now, I think the EO that really governs this is the 13839, and it does some great things like trying to get those terminations out of the grievance procedures, and as Jane mentioned, not tying an agency down to the lowest level of discipline ever provided to an employee in the entire agency. But it's also, when you do reductions in force, being able to look at performance and not just longevity in determining who you're going to ask to leave in a RIF, not requiring the PAP and the suspension and all of the progressive discipline. You know what? When somebody's driving the getaway car at a bank robbery, do I really need to do progressive discipline? Right? What else is there? And that's why, though, I think I would like to see a distinction between misconduct and poor performance, right? There should, many private sector companies, they have I hate to say this way, but they basically have a death penalty list, a list of particular types of misconduct which will immediately result in termination. That's something Congress could do, actually, is to develop that list and say, guess what? Sexual harassment, if it's proven, you're out. Bringing a gun to work on a federal workplace, you do it, you're out. Using government property to run your own business, you do it, you're out. That is, to me, that's the low-hanging fruit. And why don't we just go ahead and go after that first? One of the things that now the question is our executive orders, is it working? Unfortunately, of course, there's been delay in implementation because of the injunction, but there is one section of the 13839 that's not enjoined, and that is a data collection requirement. And as Katie says, it's just data collection, it's just transparency. And what's supposed to be happening, and it's not enjoined, is that the agencies report who was terminated and for why, and how the process went, on a form that was created by OPM. And then that's supposed to be gathered by OPM, and then OPM is supposed to give it to OMB, and OMB is supposed to publish data without identifying the particular agency. OMB's form, the first submission was due in January, and I found the blank form where the agencies are supposed to report how many SES and non-SES separately, how many were terminated, how many were on PIPs, how long were the PIPs, and other information. And I think we really need that before we can judge whether or not the EOs are having an impact. I was unable, despite the effort of transparency, and maybe you guys can do better than me, I couldn't find a single completed form on the internet anywhere, just the blank form. So the data was supposed to be collected, but as far as I know, and I called somebody at DOL, and his answer was, well, if we were supposed to submit it, I'm sure we did, right? But I literally could not find anything. Maybe what we'll need here is a FOIA to get to get a view of these forms, because without increasing in discipline, increases in terminations, and this is something the form doesn't ask for, tracking of these performance ratings, we will never have accountability. And I want to say, as I turn this over to Bill, who has been long served in the senior executive service, I don't think there's really a difference between political and SES. We all want to manage and get rid of those, certainly employees that have horrible misconduct, but also be able to manage performance, which right now you can't really do in the federal government.
Thank you, Tammy. All right, our last speaker on the last panel is Bill Valdez. Bill is president of the Senior Executives Association. He was appointed to that post 3 years ago. He sets the SEA's overall direction on its engagement with policy debates on behalf of not just the senior executive service, but also all career civil service employees. He served for 20 years in the Department of Energy in a variety of posts laid out in the brochure. He's now serving as an adjunct faculty member at AU's School of Public Affairs. I want to say Bill and I were connected a couple years ago by our friend of the audience, Jeffrey Salmon, and I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Bill now for a couple of years on the search for bipartisan consensus reforms on modernizing the civil service in conjunction with other friends here in the audience and elsewhere. And I've learned a lot in my work with Bill over this time. I really appreciate this collaboration. It's a real pleasure to have you here today, Bill.
Well, thank you, Adams. So I'd like to start off with the executive orders themselves, and this will be brief. The Senior Executive Association supports them. We really believe that, as James said and a few other people have said today, that they're intended to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of government. And that's a goal we can all embrace. Whether you quibble with certain parts of it, the overall goal is the right goal. And in terms of accountability, as Tammy just very clearly articulated, we have a lot of work to do there. And the executive orders are a partial answer, but we'll wait for Katie to get their act together in Congress, to do a real full, accountability measure. On collective bargaining, our experience has been that collective bargaining is one of the biggest barriers to an effective and efficient government that is out there. It impacts everything from personnel decisions to use of materials within the government, allocation of resources, and it is a complete nightmare if you are involved in the collective bargaining agreements or having to, wind your way through it when you're hiring people, when you're, doing something as simple as an office move. It's just a nightmare. And then finally, on official time, the abuses are apparent to anybody who's ever been in a bureaucracy. You see people who are devoted full-time to doing nothing but helping other employees grieve. And so the executive orders on their face, are a good thing, a positive thing. And even though they're being held up right now, I think it's also prompting a very good debate in Washington on those three issues. Now, apropos of nothing, I want to turn my attention to this 17% statistic that both Katie and James trotted out just recently. And I'm reminded of the saying, I think it was Mark Twain or somebody, there are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics. And in this particular case, that statistic is extremely flawed and misused, and I hope to correct it in this setting and in other settings, because we're talking about the law of averages and the mean, okay? And the statistics show that those employees that are GS 1 through 12 make more than their private sector counterparts. And you can see, executive assistants in the federal government making $70,000, $80,000. In the private sector, they would make, $30,000, $40,000 maximum, okay? And so it's the lower pay grades that are out of whack. They also are the largest percentage of the federal workforce. When you get up to the higher grades, particularly 14, 15, and SES, which are the smaller portion of the population, they are grossly underpaid, grossly underpaid. So this is an issue that matters not just to my members, the Senior Executives Association, but it also should matter to the future of the federal workforce, because we want to turn the workforce into something other than a low wage, administrative workforce into a high-tech workforce, a high-tech workforce that's responsive to the American public's requirements. That's not going to happen so long as we have this inverse relationship between pay in the private sector and in the public sector. So Katie, in the future, if you would point that out, I'd be very appreciative.
And Bill is not incorrect, and I think that's why we're talking about averages. The people on the higher end of the educational scale are shown to oftentimes be compensated at a lower level in the private sector, and as he said, at the lower level of the education spectrum, at a higher level. What the federal employees do also have, though, that is not typical in the private sector is a desirable pension and also the job security, shutdowns aside, that come with it. But you're absolutely right, and that's why I think
your 17% figure
It's the
includes
average.
the benefits too.
it does include the benefits,
Yes.
which other surveys say completely leave out and skew. But
Yeah. So like I said,
I
apropos of
grant
nothing.
that to you.
You know. Anyway.
But it would be a good idea to, I agree with that, because like assistant secretaries, you know, I'm going to talk about my friend Eric Dryband, right?
I am going to get back to this during the Q&A. Won't we let
But you're
Okay.
right, I agree with you, Bill.
We're
Okay.
ready.
Yeah.
So now to this particular panel, you know, and a particular focus on, you know, political accountability in the administrative state. When I hear that phrase, what I think about is delivering value to the American taxpayer. That is what the meaning of political accountability is. Are we, Congress, career civil servants, and the political appointees delivering value? Are we being accountable to the American taxpayer, who after all pays our salaries? That's what that means to me. And I think, you know, the executive orders, you know, are a step in the right direction to help delivering that political accountability, because if you increase the effectiveness and efficiency of the government, you per se are going to be delivering higher value to the American taxpayer. So that's all a good thing. For the senior executives, it has special meaning, because when the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act was passed, it put the senior executives in between the general schedule employees, those 2 million employees, and the political administration. And so the SES have two real functions in that regard. One is to help the administration implement its agenda. And then second, to ensure that there is a transfer of knowledge, stability, you know, that they are the group that keeps the government running during times of transition, but also helps the political appointees do the non-administration kinds of things. Those are all good. What we've been noticing, though, at the Senior Executives Association is that there's been considerable confusion between the roles and responsibilities of the career SES and the political appointees. And we actually published a study in January that was talking about, is the government at risk of failure because of these confusing roles and some other factors? And our conclusion was yes, you know, the government is at risk of failure. And so, you know, one thing that I would like to see is an increased dialogue on what political accountability means within the context of senior leadership within the federal government, but also how that then leads to the more effective, you know, delivery of service to the American taxpayer. Because when you get right down to it, you know, there's real confusion in Washington right now about the role of government. Okay? It's become a zero-sum game in many respects. And it's even become a zero-sum game within the bureaucracy itself. So when you have when you become a senior executive, you have to fill out what are called executive core qualifications, and there's 5 of them, you know, leading change and all the rest, leading people, business acumen, and things like that. What's interesting about those is that when I teach at American University and when I hold courses with other, you know, rising leaders, you know, I ask them, why is it that you lead change in the federal government? why is it that you need to know how to build coalitions? And usually the answer I get is, well, we want to, do our job better. We want to, produce more widgets, And I finally have to stop and say, no. The reason you are doing those things is that you are delivering value to the American taxpayer. That's the sole purpose you are here. And we've lost that ethic here in Washington. We have lost sight of the fact that we're here on behalf of the American taxpayer. And so one of the things that we're trying to do at the Senior Executives Association, in collaboration with folks like Adam and John York and other folks in this room, is restore that notion that government is here to serve the people. And so that's actually the basis of the coalition that Adam and I and a number of other folks in this room are working to achieve. And Katie, you mentioned that it's really hard to get anything through Congress. I think the two problems are related, right? We're so caught up in our internecine warfare, between the political parties and the political toxicity that exists in Washington right now, that we've lost sight of this notion that government is really an instrument of the people. And that if we're going to be delivering better value to the American taxpayer, we have to do that through civil service modernization. Not civil service reform, because we already had the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. We need to modernize that act. And so the group that Adam and I have been working on, it has been looking at accountability, hiring, retention, reskilling, retraining, and simplifying things, administrative requirements, regulatory requirements, as bipartisan actions that we could take that would really move the needle. And so we're going to be, as soon as Adam completes his work on some projects,
A little busy planning events.
Be working together to develop a legislative package for the Congress and for the administration that I think will help push the needle. So, I think ultimately, the answer to your question, how do we get something through Congress? How do we do something that will really move the needle? It's all about building the right coalitions and developing the right language that enables us to convince the American public that we're doing something on their behalf.
Thanks, Bill. I suddenly find myself needing to make that standard disclaimer. Just to be very clear here, the project that Bill and I have been collaborating on is not a project of the Gray Center. It's something I'm doing from my other home at the Hoover Institution. So having made that standard disclaimer, I want to get back to the big picture question about serving the American people. But beforehand, we had, there's two items that popped up really quick that I want to give folks a chance to weigh in on. We already talked a little bit about the 17% statistic. We want to talk about that a bit more. And I'm also just very curious to get Katie and Bill's instant reaction to Tammy's notion of a death penalty list. That's death penalty issues, not death penalty for employees, just to be very clear here. But I'd be very curious for your reactions to that proposal. Yeah. Katie?
Gosh, I hadn't heard that phrase before, but it reminds me of a little bit of the phrase in Waiting for Superman with the rubber rooms, the retire in place and leading into your death list. But I think from a Congressional Hill staffer standpoint, I think what we try to do is to take the leads we have when we see poor performance or misconduct and really flesh out what's happening so that we can make a case either to a federal agency or if it's a policy matter for what change needs to happen. So I would defer to Bill in terms of how the agencies themselves might be able to import that into the federal space. But one thing Tammy did say that struck me, at one point she asked Congress to do something about sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and I think this is this really interesting case study, and it's one that I know some of us have wrestled with the last few years because we started a project where we started looking at agency table of penalties. So these really, they're not binding, but they should be what guide agency personnel for the roughly appropriate discipline that's enacted for a given infringement. And we specifically narrowed in on what the table of penalties say for sexual misconduct, sexual harassment. And what we found in this oversight report that you can still find online if you look for House Government Reform Oversight Report on table of penalties, most agencies have not, one, updated their table of penalties, but don't have an actual definition for what sexual misconduct actually is. The EPA, for example, at the time this report was published in 2017, hadn't updated it since 1980. There are case studies in there of different unfortunate behavior that had happened that really either went unpunished or on its face didn't seem to be sufficiently punished. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. At the end of this report, there you can agree with them or disagree with them. There are a series of recommendations for what the Hill should be doing, and those have not progressed yet, as I think some of us hoped that they would. But to Bill's point, I agree with a lot of what he's saying. I think we need external forces to push the hand on the Hill on the legislative side. There are a lot of really good people on both sides of the aisle who want to get things done. We spent a lot of time in a room last Congress, for example, trying to get what we were calling 40 ideas for 40 smaller bills done that we could maybe push forward to commemorate the anniversary and fix some smaller things that we thought were pretty benign. We need an external force to kind of help us make our members understand that as a whole, not any particular member, but we need the push, we need the support. It's not going to happen on its own in the Hill because the Hill's inherently risk averse.
Bill, do you want to weigh in on the death penalty
I know it was an unfortunate term, but
Well, you know,
The zero tolerance, we'll call it the zero tolerance policy.
tolerance, yes.
so you run smack up against due process. And unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer, although I play one on television occasionally. You know, the problem with the death penalty is that it bumps up against, you know, the employee's right to hold the job, you know, and that's unique in the federal government. I forget what the case is, but
Supreme Court case, property right.
right, the job is a property right, and so you have to go through due process.
But let me ask you, is this the only thing that meets due process?
Oh, no,
All
no,
of
no,
this?
no. Stick with me, Tammy.
Okay,
Stick
okay.
with me. But let's take a case like sexual harassment, which is really a very interesting aspect of due process in the federal government. I had a member of my association who was terminated on 30 days' notice based on an IG report of sexual harassment that he was not asked to give evidence to, and was terminated. Okay, no due process. You know, the agency made up the process. Okay, and they did not have, I think they're called Douglas factors, right?
That's right.
You know, so he did not have any. The Douglas factor was, you know, if it appears kind of bad, you maybe could terminate. But it almost said I think it said in the Douglas factors, but first you really want to do counseling and other things, right? So this was his first offense, and it was really fairly minor in the greater scheme of things. And I say that as a father of 3 daughters. So, you know, so it really comes down to a question of due process. And, you know, the examples Tammy gave, I'm sorry, you know, until they're convicted of the crime, there's a presumption of innocence. You know, and you can't take away their rights until that happens. So I don't see how you would create a death penalty.
Real quick, and then I want to
Yeah, I
get
was
one other
just gonna-
subject on.
I'm drawing a picture.
While she's drawing, I just,
This is sufficient for due process. Agency investigation, Merit Service Protection Board, federal court. Right? Isn't this better than this, at least on misconduct issues? Right? Why do you need 4 agencies plus 2 avenues inside an agency?
I think we need a discussion on what the right balance is because due process should be protected, right?
certainly.
But we also see the case studies where, for example, there was an investigation that I worked on once in the House where there was a senior official at one agency who had been under investigation for a decade, referred to U.S. attorneys, and we know from data that IGs now have to report that we have about 16,000 referrals each year to our IGs, criminal referrals. In this particular case, this dragged on for a decade, and this was a very serious case with, you name it, businesses being run on agency time, contract steering, you go down the line. There are very serious things happening in this particular case. At the end, a lot of the cases that end up being referred are too small to be taken up, and things don't always happen with them. Nothing would have happened in this case had somebody not notified Congress. Congress started digging, and then there was a different type of political accountability that came through the process that we have with our public perch. But I think there's a balance in getting it right that's really important to figure out.
Let me ask two sort of related big picture questions, and then we'll have some audience questions, and we'll break for the reception at 2:55. Just talking about what the purpose of the civil service is. You know, I've heard it described a couple of ways. Bill, you talked about it a couple of times as delivering value to the American taxpayer. And Katie, in your remarks, you said the civil service exists to serve the American people. And I think we all can agree with that, like at a very high level of generality. I'm just curious if there's any way to make that more concrete, right? Who ultimately does the civil service answer to directly? Is it the political appointees at the agencies? Is it Congress? Right? They don't meet, you know, with the taxpayers every day to sort of account for their jobs. There has to be some sort of intermediary. How should we think about who's ultimately in control of this?
So the simple answer is they should be meeting with the taxpayer. You know, I preach over and over again to anybody who will listen that if you're not talking to your key constituents and your stakeholders and finding out what they want, you're not doing your job right. That's the nature of being a career civil servant.
Okay, but even on that, Bill, who's, when you say like the key stakeholders or constituents,
Well, it
what does that mean?
depends on the mission of the agency, the job, and that sort of thing. But the normal civil servant has few interactions with Congress and few interactions with a political appointee. I mean, it's just not an everyday occurrence. It's the SES that do that. So in terms of translating the will of Congress and the will of the president, it's the responsibility of the SES to enable that process to happen. And it happens better in some cases than in others, and you see the best places to work surveys. Leadership communication and leadership engagement are often one of the things that drives morale at an agency. So if they can effectively communicate what the will of the American people is, then their scores go up, you know. But I'm reminded of the famous, JFK visit down to NASA, where he met a janitor and said, what do you do, Mr. Janitor? And the janitor says, I help put a man on the moon. And that should be the attitude of every civil servant in the federal government. If you don't know why you are in your job and how you are serving the American taxpayer and delivering on your mission, then we have failed you as a civil servant.
But let me just hector you a little more because we're friends. If you can't hector your friends, who can you hector? I mean, use the word like agency mission, right? Mm-hmm. Who decides what an agency mission is?
Congress and the administration.
Okay. Right.
And I want to add one more thing for the senior executive service. You mentioned transition. To me, that's when they're most needed, mm-hmm. because without the senior executive service briefing the incoming political appointees, the policy making, really the business of an agency can come to a screeching halt because it is a steep learning curve mm-hmm. when you come in. And it's only the senior executive service that can bridge that gap from one administration for another. It also makes them very, very important that you can trust your mm-hmm. senior executive service, that they're going to be giving you all the information you need, because there's no way as a political leader that you can go out and find all the information, mm-hmm. that you can uncover all of the key issues that are facing your agency. So they have a very important role, and that's why I'm so happy to hear. Here's my question, Bill. Senior Executive Service supports these EOs. In the surveys, most of the federal employees at all levels support the EOs. The administration supports the EOs. So why aren't the EOs, I mean, who is opposing it? I mean, and this is maybe it's just the unions, and that's exactly what it's going. It's just the unions, right? That's what's preventing Katie from getting a good bill through, and I think that's something we all have to think about and maybe talk about some more. It's like everybody wants this change, except for the unions.
Well, and we've had conversations with the, Jerry Connolly and Chris Van Hollen and, the Dems on the House and Senate side and say, why can't you support the executive orders? Why can't you support some of the civil service modernization? And it always gets back to, well, I have a lot of federal employees in my district, and the unions are always on my case, about this stuff. And so I think the answer to that is the coalitions and getting private sector involved, not just, the NGOs and associations like us, but the Koch brothers. They should be in the arena here in Washington. We need to have the Amazons and all the big corporations in here telling Congress enough of this nonsense, and if they need to, give them their freaking campaign contributions more than the unions are currently doing. That's the way the system works.
Hey, do you have any thoughts on this? Then I think we'll go to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, what Bill just said, I agree with him. There has to be some type of cocoon given to Congress here to feel like they can do this and not be so risk averse that they just continue to let the civil service languish for another 40 years. In terms of how exactly are we accountable to the people? I do think that we have political leadership of our agencies that manage from the top down, and when the people don't like the political leadership that we've put in place, we kick them out. That's how it should work. We're so big, it's hard to have every person in a 2 million non-postal federal government interfacing with the American public as much as they need to, as much as we can make it happen. I think that's great, but we do have a hierarchy of representation, and we're supposed to keep that in check from where we sit up on the Hill too. I do think the name is interesting. I just find this fascinating personally, having been up here for almost 20 years now. I used to have lovely conversations with Senator Tom Carper, and I don't think he'd mind me telling this story out of school because it's a heartfelt complaint of his, is that he hates the word bureaucracy. He just thinks that gives this impression of a faceless bureaucracy and isn't fair to the people working in the agencies that are going to work and serving the American public every day. I think when I was working at Senate Homeland Security for Senator Tom Coburn, we took that to heart and we tried not to use that word, especially in respect to Senator Carper, who was our chairman. We're in a very different environment now where bureaucracy seems very tame to the swamp, right? So I find myself using that phrase more just because our rhetoric has changed a little bit. But I do find just even our word choice fascinating and how it's evolved the last 10 years.
Well, as with the previous panels, we have some audience microphones. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. This is being recorded. We'll start over here, ma'am, and then the second question will be George.
Hi, I'm pretty loud. So I have a brief comment on the topic you just talked about, and then a specific question, primarily for Katie, but I guess for all of you. The first thing is, Bill just laid out one way to create a counterweight to concentrated opposition, right? Whose lives are the unions are representing people whose lives are directly affected by these things. Whereas if you laid out the chart that Tammy keeps pulling up to the average American employed in the private sector, right? They're like, this is outrageous and crazy, but their interests are dispersed. It's not on the top of anybody's priorities list, so you get that counterweight. I mean, so Bill laid out one way, I think, which would be to involve corporations. The other way, of course, would be to actually, find a way to talk about this that the American people find relevant to their day-to-day political interests. I've written a lot on that sort of angle on this topic, and would love to communicate with any of you afterwards and exchange cards, because I would love to take some of the stories that you guys are talking about. I think that's one way of communicating that to people, because the average American doesn't have the faintest idea that it's this hard to fire people for such egregious misconduct. So that's the comment. But the second thing is just a question. Katie, you laid out a pretty bleak picture of what's possible legislatively. It seems to me that the one bright spot in the last couple years on this issue has been the VA Accountability Act, which passed with bipartisan support and did address, I mean, not to the level that I think a lot of us in this room would like to see, but did make some reforms to these kinds of processes for, who can be terminated and how long it takes and all that stuff. Is there any possibility of expanding those reforms piecemeal to agencies? Like, would the same people who supported it for the VA, maybe they'll support it for, some other important agency? And then, is there any way forward on that?
It's a keen comment and question. I appreciate that. I think there were a group of people on the Hill that was hoping that the reforms that we saw in the VA context could be expanded out. I do think that it's easier to get things done when we're doing them for veterans and those that have served the country and have put their lives on the line. And I think that is, to your first point, there's a better awareness in the American public of those issues. And I think if we can figure out, with Bill's help and the help of other entities in the private sector, how to dialogue on the non-VA side of the house, what our challenges are and what we need to fix, it would be extremely helpful. A case study of that, when you're saying we need to better articulate this to the American public, I don't think, going to official time as the example, I mean, that's anathema. I don't think people outside of DC really understand that concept, because when you start to explain it outside of the Beltway here, you have to go through it several times for the concept to register. We had a hearing a few years ago that looked at, it was on a different issue, but in the midst of the hearing, official time at USPTO came up, and one of the witnesses, she was the head of POPA, the union for the patent side of the House, a member of Congress, Jody Heiss from Georgia, said, okay, I need to understand this, because it's not making sense to me, this concept of official time. So you are, and they walked through the series of questions, but the short end of the story was that this was a GS-15 making somewhere in the range of 140, 150, trained in chemical engineering patents, and for 8 years hadn't cleared a single patent because she was on 100% union official time that entire period of time. And I think when we're talking about that and what are we doing for the American people, and you take contextual examples, we should be able to figure something out that's reasonable. The statute states that official time should be used for reasonable use, and I think there's a fair argument to say that we've gotten off kilter, and that's what the EOs are trying to address. But we do need more support from the public, and we do need to get the balance right so that we don't swing too far against the civil service, because it's hard enough right now to recruit millennials as it is.
Okay, and the last question will be George.
Yeah, it's, no,
Yep, it's on.
it's on.
Yep.
Yeah, kind of an observation for Katie. We talked about the difficulties of the legislative process and the chances of snowball in hell of getting reasonable legislation through to address even
George's words.
what we all agree are serious problems in the delivery of services in government. We don't have much of an opportunity to address like problems in Congress. There are rules and procedures that we are not players in, that Congress has established, that are today dysfunctional. The rules of the Senate, for example, are 19th century rules.
How much time do we have?
For a 19th century country,
Right.
and 19th century, when comedy still played in the halls and people, actually senators, talked to each other. 21st century Congress looks very different. The country's very different. The confirmation process now, much more complicated, a hell of a lot more agencies than we had in the 19th century. The rules have to change, not for partisan purposes, for practical purposes. I noticed now that they've speeded up in this session of the Senate, speeded up the debate to try to get some of these confirmations through. We're talking hundreds of jobs that Congress created with no safety valve for filling them when they're vacant. Places like the MSPB hasn't had a chairman for 2.5 years, 2,000 cases backlogged. People are on payroll there. We're paying taxpayers salaries for work that's not getting done. Nothing's getting done there. The fairness to the agencies who are trying to process people out through the MSPB appeals, the employees that are trying to get a fair hearing through the MSPB and out to court, all that is, who cares up there?
You know, this is one of my favorite topics. I wish we had another hour to do George's comments justice, and perhaps this will just be the talk at the reception after this, but I would say...
We have about 30 seconds.
We have about 30 seconds. I will say I think putting whether or not rules should be reformed aside, we need a lot more transparency of what actually does happen behind the veil in the Senate. You wouldn't believe the process we have for actually clearing bills that aren't the ones that maybe rise to the occasion of getting to the Senate floor. And if there's one thing I care a lot about reforming in my time left on the Hill, that would be one of them. So I'm happy to chat later about that.
I want to just leave in response to the question over here. I think we could move faster if we separated misconduct issues from poor performance issues, because they're just clearer issues. And in the private sector, you know, I think people will agree, yeah, somebody who was, you know, was driving the getaway car while getting paid leave, that's a problem. Whereas also in the private sector, we all have had supervisors who say we're not performing well, which we disagree with. And so if we could, I think we could start with misconduct first and maybe make more, make more progress.
Bill, do you have any closing thoughts on this?
No, this was good.
Oh, great. I do want to say something I like to point out when we do events here, and as I mentioned, this wraps up our year where we've done several events here at the Decatur House. There's a bust, a statue outside of Gordon Gray, the father of C. Boyden Gray. It's a happy coincidence that we do the events here. We didn't pick it because of that family connection. The reason why the bust is out there is because Mr. Gray, Gordon Gray, led the National Trust for Historic Preservation that helped save the buildings around Lafayette Square and so on. And one of the things I've always enjoyed about doing events here in this building, in addition to the fact that it's just a beautiful space, is that that sort of commemoration of the National Trust reminds us that institutions don't preserve themselves, right? It takes hard work of public servants, politicians, civil servants, and others to maintain these institutions. And so it's been a real joy to do these events here this year, and looking forward to seeing you in the fall when we return to this subject and others. But I hope you'll join me to end this by thanking our speakers.